Well, it's now my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, who is an expert on the prevention of youth violence and exploitation. Caleb Jackson serves as the head of change for the youth and voluntary sector at the Youth Endowment Fund in Wales. Caleb has an extensive and fascinating background. He began his youth work at the age of 16 and has had a keen focus on preventing young people from entering the criminal justice system and getting involved in youth violence and exploitation. He has a degree in youth and community studies, but his personal expertise has been shaped by mentoring high-risk individuals involved in gangs and also by running youth club activities. In his role at the Youth Endowment Fund, Caleb leads the youth sector initiative, engaging key external stakeholders to focus on two priority areas: trusted adults and positive activities. Caleb will explain how youth work can be instrumental in reducing youth violence and will emphasize the importance of demonstrating evidence of impact within youth development organizations. This is such an important topic for all of us to gain deeper understanding and knowledge. Please join me in welcoming to the United for Youth Conference, Caleb Jackson.
I'm looking forward to this.
Thanks so much, Yolanda and Susan, and hello to everybody from the United Kingdom. I'm in what's called the East Midlands, so that's central of the country, a very small country compared to yours in that regard. But great to be at this international event, United for Youth, with you at World Youth Clubs. I just want to say thank you to all the different colleagues who have supported us to be here to speak on such vital issues. I'm going to give you a context which you'll be able to align with, certainly for many of you who are working with young people who unfortunately have, through the level of need that they have and complexity, are involved with violence and crime. I didn't choose to work with young people who, in this country, we say hard to reach, which is an interesting term because it suggests that no one can ever get to them. I call them need to reach because it suggests that we must reach them in some form or the other. So 20 years, Yolanda, thank you so much for sharing my background. And I ended up in this kind of research world because I was looking at how can we make greater change happen. So I'm a youth worker. If you cut me, I'm a youth worker through and through, and superb to be here. And I'll talk to you about a few bits going forward. So I've got a slide deck, and this will be available to you post conference. And what wonderful display of internationalities. I didn't see Ghana though, so you'll have to tell me if Ghana is around, if we have any representation. If not, let me have and I'll have a conversation with the president, prime minister over in Ghana, so to get that together. So the Youth Endowment Fund, our organization, is a not-for-profit, you would call it. We call it a charity, and it's set up to do these two things. One, we have a vision where no child becomes involved in violence. And two, our mission, the thing that we can look at young people at and tell them in 10 years, well, in 2030, because we are an endowment. So we've been given money by the government to commit to research, to find what works and build a movement to put this knowledge into practice. Finding what works, I'll tell you a bit more about that in a minute. But like I said, I got into a bit of apathy and disbelief when working with systems and the complex nature of systems. So what's the cut through? And the evidence that YEF produces can help to bring about change. We're all here about change in young people's lives. I've heard some tremendous stories, and congratulations to the winners who are making a difference in the lives of young people. So before we do that, it's impossible to speak with you without getting young people in the room. You know, we as adults were often criticized for not having young people speak and have interactions with the work that we do to them or with them. And so this is our CVV, Children Violence and Vulnerability Report, and it's got the voices of 7,500 young people in England and Wales, the coverage that we have. And we have done a couple of things. One is we've listened to them about their experiences of youth violence. And we think it's the largest survey of this sort in the world. And then on the secondary element, we look at what the trends around data tells us is happening. And then we combine them and produce this report. We got another one coming out in 2024, and it's a state of the nation around young people and youth violence. So really, really typical. I'm going to read you out some figures, and I'm sure through the media and news, you would have heard of different incidents that are taking place here in the UK, in England and Wales, and certainly just last week we had another 15-year-old murdered in London. And so it's pretty prevalent, and the type of violence that we see here is very different to most places that knives are sharp instruments are leading the way compared to, for example, guns. And so, and I'm also wary that there are fellow colleagues who are from much wider than just the United States, so Africa and South America and so on and so forth, and the context will be different there too. But this is what they told us. 1 in 34,000 of our 1.7 million teenage children are murdered. And this is based on last year's figures. 1 in 3,400, that's 500 are admitted to hospital. We think that's much higher for some form of knife violence. 1 in 25 tell us that they carry a knife. And as we have a bit of an epidemic around knife carrying amongst children and young people. And what is coming out of that is the fact that there is a fear of safety. So there are people down the road that are carrying knives, so I should protect myself, and that seemed to be the ballpark of why young people are carrying knives. Interestingly, the government have just released a national amnesty, which took place and came into legislation last week, and that's an amnesty bin is where you drop off weapons into a bin which are placed in community settings and police stations. And right now, from a Youth Endowment Fund point of view, we do not know the impact on that on violence in that regard. So a bit of a hot potato from the political realm. Should we be doing it? Should we not be? Every mother, father will be saying, let's get the really dangerous things off the road. Part of our narrative would be, well, we still have an issue that children can just go into the kitchen and carry a knife in that regard. So lots to think about. 1 in 20 told us they're in gangs. 1 in 7 said they've perpetrated violence, which is really interesting because you wouldn't expect young people to be so honest, and they are. And we handle that with much care and security. 1 in 6 have told us that they're a victim of violence. 1 in 4 said they are either victim or perpetrator of violence. And we have a anglicized conversation about, well, is the victim not the perpetrator and the perpetrator not the victim? And there's a lot of crossover. Sometimes we can get quite polarized in this discussion that the person who did the perpetration is the criminal and never a victim. But when you start to unpack the lives of individuals, you start to realize that it's very overlapping in that regard. And then 1 in 2 have either, and this is a phenomenal stat for all the wrong reasons. 1 in 2 have either witnessed or have been a victim of violence, which is stark. So half our children are either witnessing or are having violence done to them. So there's alarm bells here, and this is what young people are telling us. So YEF is here to push for change. When we don't just build evidence. I'm not sure how many of you build evidence or work with evaluators, but there's a real kind of interesting narrative around the value of evaluation and what it can do. We look to use that evaluation to work with these 7 sectors, and you will see there formally the youth sector is very central to solutions. And what's quite interesting, and you will recognize this too, is that the youth sector works in all those other settings in one way or another. So it's such an important feature in that regard. So this is just a really top level of how we function. And Yolanda mentioned that we should be looking at the best ways to evidence our impact. So I'm not sure what it's like in where you are, but certainly one of the first things I say is, how are you evidencing impact for the work that you're doing with young people? And the simplest tool for that is really robust evaluation, pre and post testing. Randomized control trials, which, if done ethically, can tell us what sort of impact programs are having. Often, it's quite a neglected area to build the evidence base for the youth sector. And that's certainly what we're finding here. You go to psychological therapies and you're inundated with lots of research that shows the prominence and the effect of programs that work with people. When you look in the under the bonnet for in England and Wales, you find that it's less robust. There is evidence. Most of it lives in the qualitative world. Not much lives in the quantitative world. So when we're testing for impact, we aren't sure as to how youth work makes a difference. So I would really implore and encourage colleagues to really think about, when you're doing your bid writing, when you're meeting with commissioners, when you're meeting with decision makers, as much as this is about making sure that the tap's running and you're operating and you're meeting your mission one and client one, which is your young people, actually there is a secondary measure, which is about invest in the work that we do so we can show what sort of impact we have. And that's good for down the line when we're talking about sustainability and resourcing. And at a very micro level, that means that organizations have to be very on top of it when it comes to monitoring and evaluation. What happens with children? Where is that recorded? Who knows about it? Who should know about it? And therefore, what is the journey of the child? And how can we look at things? Then you'll hear amongst the narrative these days, theory of change. I mean, this is our theory of change for our strategic operations or strategic objectives. So this slide just really says that YEF is here to fund good work, which means what is available evidence and research to date on a particular topic that we're interested in, that one of those 7 essential sectors is interested in. Then how do we make that available? Because once we've found what work, where does it go? And we've got this fancy thing called a toolkit, which I'll spend a little time on. And then we produce what's called practice guidance, which is these are the practical things that people can do here and now so that the evidence is making change happen. And then here is system guidance. And this is about policy. This is about the wider reaching frameworks of a system and how, as youth workers, you can make a difference, but also how those governing bodies linked to politics and other things, funders, power players, can play their role. Because often the two are separate. We often don't think or view things the same. So evidence allows us to convene and to come together and coalesce around potential change for children. And the last bit here is we work for change. So once we find the good work, we find what we think about who needs to do this work based on the sectors. We then say, right, how do we get this out to market? How do we get to the right people? So just earlier today here in England, at about 12 o'clock our time, which is very early for you, I was holding a virtual learning cafe about the impact of youth work in social skills and emotional training, which is in a school setting. And so that's about what's the available evidence, what do we know, how can we get it out to both delivery body and to commissioners and others who want to end schools, in this example, to ensure these are the ways that you could implement it well, which will have the most effect to help children and young people. And then change, we've reformed systems. That's working with the people who care about, from the sectors, the 7 essential sectors, the people who care about that particular industry. There's a lot of siloing, and I understand. I mean, I used to be like, why don't they just talk to each other? And because of the large numbers of individuals who work within a particular sector, it's really, really difficult. So we are sector focused, but we are the thread to ensure that young people's lives are improved and the outcomes improve too. And then underneath that is we'll understand the situation, which is we talk to young people. I showed that and demonstrated that to you through the Children Violence and Vulnerability report. We share the understanding of violence, that's the scales, the trends, and what the causes are. So we get to the root of where is some of this stuff happening. Certainly in the UK, you'll hear in England and Wales how we've gone from a universal open access service through to it's very targeted, and that's where a lot of the resources are going for all things that may or may not work or even cause harm for children. And a big shout out to the to Andy Hamill and the rest of the team in England and Wales, who I'll be speaking there on Sunday in Cardiff for the national conference. So looking forward to being with those guys too, and I'll give a whoop whoop. So, in terms of the youth sector's role in preventing violence, what I'm about to share with you is the current picture that we have about what role the youth sector is currently playing, just generally, but also what role they can play in the future. And this is leading into our practice guidance. This is our scope. We're trying to understand the youth sector so that we can do the right things for it and with it. And so the idea here is to get the summary so we identify where the gaps are and then think about where we might commission further research, which will produce some form of evidence-based practice. So as a kickoff, what do we mean by youth work? This comes from DCMS. This is Department for Culture, Media and Sport. And it's youth work is aims to give young people something to do, somewhere to go, and someone to talk to. Really simply, that's the pedagogy and the approach that youth work takes. When we talk about youth work, we're talking about positive activities, sports, targeted sports program, arts, adventure, mentoring, summer jobs programs, and amongst many others. And also, we know that it's normally run by youth workers, professional youth workers, and volunteers. And just on the point of that, there is a professionalization of the industry. I think that needs to occur because of the professionalization of the industries we work with. And so, for us to be on the A list in terms of representing the child, we've got to be able to navigate between the already existing systems on behalf of advocacy for the child, and that means a lot more paperwork, a lot more recording, things that aren't natural to our brilliant relationship builders in terms of that. But I'm seeing certainly more in my own career as a youth worker. I came to realize that this stuff is really as important as meeting with the young person. It happens in a wide and very variety of settings: youth clubs, religion or religious organizations, actually custody suites, street corners. So that's how we're defining youth work in England and Wales. So what's happening? What's taking place? And obviously, and most importantly, the children's participation should be voluntary. I think personally, take my YEF hat off. Like, if it's not voluntary, and we can't really call it youth work, it's something different. And there's a whole debate to have about that. I don't have much research to support that claim at this moment. So just to kind of kick off, here is a summary of what we found to date. So 50% of all 10-year-olds in England and Wales attend some form of youth activity. But disadvantaged children still struggle. And when I say disadvantaged, what that means is those with what we call a net negative income monthly. So that's your income household. This is from what's known as the United Kingdom Household Longitudinal Study. And so what it looks like is how much income is in the house and who's going to youth activities, all that means. And the more money you have, the more things you go to, which makes sense. But what's quite interesting is that where homes had a negative net income monthly, children still access services. And our belief is that it's because the services were free and there's no cost to them. There's a whole debate about, do you charge children to attend youth clubs or not? Then the 37% of 10 to 15-year-olds still attend youth clubs. So there's a real fundamental central place for youth clubs, even still in today's climate. I'm not sure about you, but 2011 for us was a pivotal year for resources. And this next kind of stat talks to us about that. 60% of our resources, which was led by what we call the local authority. Local authority is what governs a local area. It's the council in that regard. 60% of the funding that came from there to youth services and youth providers and youth workers vanished. And so we have a workforce that's depleted because there are 4,500 less youth workers. And I mean, if I was to put it into context, take one of your major states and just take out 4,500 youth workers and then see the ramifications of what happens next. And that's certainly what we've had here across England and Wales. I mean, I must say also, Wales has done a very good job because they are self-governed, although they are under the British Parliament. Wales has done a good job to actually invest more in youth work than in England. So their reduction was only 37%. And so they have quite the well-resourced youth work sector. They're always arguing, I would always argue that there needs to be more in that regard. And just following on from the cuts in the youth services, the industry here in England and Wales is about 2 billion. And so, when a quarter of that goes missing or is no longer funded, it has ramifications. And that meant that the types of delivery that organizations, skilled individuals, some of those that we've heard today, were doing in an England and Wales context, were now moving from their traditional methodologies of reaching and working with young people to very kind of what I'd say COVID resilient practice, which is around detached youth work, going out to young people, because now the building and the overheads, they need to reduce their costs. So they're having to see and find ways in which they might continue to work with young people in that regard. But the top note is that for youth work, more research is required because it's neglected. Again, like the earlier point I made, a lot of programmable operational funding goes in. When it comes to the research and evaluation, there isn't as much golden nuggets invested that way. And so because of that, when we lift up the bonnet of the car to look at the engine, we know there's an engine, but we're not sure how far this car can run because we've not really tested it like that. And then what we also learned is that the existing evidence base, which highlights the value of youth sector, shows us that the youth sector is able to reach the young people that we are most concerned about through trusted adults and through positive activities. So that's sports programs, that's drama, that's arts and other types of programs in that regard. And then lastly, the current evidence points to mentoring and target sports programs. So in an England and Wales context, the best way for colleagues who are doing youth work to impact youth violence is through the medium of mentoring and target sports program. And I'll tell you more about that as I come to land. So these are the headlines. This is where we're at in an England and Wales context. So I talked about modes of delivery. This is very interesting, and I think there's lots to take away from here. But if there's anything that you want to like fixate on, it's this. Carmen Villa did a quasi-experimental evaluation on the link between youth clubs closing and crime for those young people. And what it told us is that part of the methodology was Carmen used a cut date of 2019. This is London, and if you look closely, you can see the River Thames in the middle there. And if you're sightseeing, lovely place to go. You've got the London Eye and Big Ben and a few other things as well in that. And you might see a politician or two. They dot around quite a bit down there. But what happened was she looked at 2019 and she looked at where the clubs were closed and where they were open, and then she looked at what happened to young people. And young people were 15% more likely to commit crime where it was closed as opposed to when it was open. So that's great. This is one of the strongest pieces of evidence that we have to now. It still needs a bit more work. It's a very complicated methodology, but actually it's telling us what many youth workers in their gut were saying, that, or even local councils and police were saying, look, that centre closed. Young people are committing more of this stuff. And then there was also a claim in it that those young people were doing 11% more violent crimes. But we think this finding is tentative and it needs more investigation. What I will say is that the 15% across London, a way to test whether this is just normal, everybody during this time did more crime. Carmen smartly looked at over 18-year-olds who couldn't attend the youth club and found that their level of crime remained the same during the same period. So there's lots to take from this. There's been a big debate as to, if you speak to the National Youth Agency, which is our regulatory body here in England, not Wales, they'll say that their census, which told them that there was less provision in areas of high violence, those places had more violence take place because there was less youth clubs shot. So there's an interesting question to be answered here, and we think we can answer that. And so very quickly, I talked about toolkit. I gave you the theory of change. This is the which guide to you find. I'm not sure if you guys have a which guide, but basically, when you go to buy a car, you say these are the things I want, and then you get ratings. And in those ratings, you'll get an idea as to this fits what I want, and those what it would be graded, and then you can make your choice from that. We've done a similar thing with the toolkit, and what the toolkit is, it summarizes all the available accessible research to date. It then supports professionals who are really busy, and this is not their forte. I used to be number one for banging my head against all saying social workers. I mean, what are they? They're just a waste of time. Actually, when you understand their context, that they're working with here in England with 25 families over a period of 5 weeks to 5 months, you have to say what good can we really do, and that when you think about those intensive resources being really finite, actually they're doing an incredibly great job. And youth work, working with young people, is not their forte. So very busy people who are far removed, whose lives are very different, may live in a bubble, who have to make decisions about the young people that we are most concerned about. This becomes a best bet tool. And then finally, creating a foundation for change. And that's the whole premise. So I won't go too much detail, but this is a very sliding scale, and there are 31 approaches. Each one will give a rating on whether it has an impact on violence: high, moderate, low, no effect, impact, harmful. So Railway Prison, you guys might be familiar with that. Railway Prison was lifers who said, let's work with young people who are like us. Let's speak with them so that they don't become us. And everybody in around the town was like, "Oh, this is pretty." It got BAFTA awards. It got global awards. The film was done about it. Look, and then someone said, "Let's test this to see what actually happens to the kids." And it had a great effect on the young people. It caused them to do more offending. So the prison awareness type programs cause harm in that regard. So I just to wrap up on this, here are the top approaches, as I mentioned, for youth work, targeted sports programs, and mentoring. There's lots of other things which may or may not make sense in your context. This is just an interesting read for anybody who's interested. These are the things that colleagues can look at. These are all the different types of programs that try to specifically, across all the 7 sectors, work with young people. And we're building the evidence base to get a better understanding on that. So that's it from me. Thanks so much. I'm sure we've got time for questions, but back to Yolanda and Susan, and thank you so much. You guys are great.
Caleb, thank you so much. We greatly appreciate it. The data you presented is especially important because it shows the positive impact that not only a youth club has on a child, but also the entire community. And so I really appreciate that. And I look forward to continuing this dialogue, and I look forward to seeing you in Cardiff in a few days. So thank you so much. We really appreciate it.